Okay, so the stages of infection with HIV. The first stage is called acute HIV infection. And in this stage, about 2 to 4 weeks after coming in contact with the infection, the person will experience a sudden onset illness that feels a lot like mono. If you've ever had that, where there's a fever, your lymph nodes swell, you're really, really tired. If you've ever had mono, you know what I'm talking about. The thing is, with mono, that can last like 6 weeks. Whereas this acute HIV infection, it's more like 10 to 14 days that the person is experiencing these symptoms. So it's a shorter mono, but it feels very similar to that and has those same swollen lymph nodes. That's a really important cue, is those swollen lymph nodes. And then lymph nodes are typically going to be swollen in the, like, all over. Whereas if you were having an infection in your lungs, your lymph nodes in your armpits are likely to swell. Or you're having an infection in your sinuses, the lymph nodes in your neck are likely to swell. You have an infection in your genitals, you're going to have the lymph nodes in your groin swollen, that kind of thing. With HIV, they're all swollen. So that's a really big clue. But there are a lot of things that cause very similar symptoms to this. And so it's really super important, as I'm going through these different sexually transmitted infections and HIV in particular, that you never diagnose from your armchair. If you've been, if you've had sexual contact or shared a needle with someone and you're having any kind of symptoms, the smartest thing to do is get tested. I'm just going to insert that right now. So you have this illness, and then you get better and you feel fine, completely fine. Sometime between 3 and 12 weeks after infection, typically you'll start to show antibodies to HIV. So that means somewhere between 3 and 12 weeks, you're probably going to test positive if you have actually contracted the infection. The second stage is called asymptomatic HIV infection. Some people call this the latent stage, because during this period of time, the person has no symptoms. They have absolutely no awareness that anything is wrong. But they've got enough viral load that they actually can pass it on to other people. As the illness goes on, the viral load gets bigger, and so they become more and more contagious. But basically, from acute infection on, a person's contagious even if they don't have any symptoms. This phase can last years. Back in the early days, they thought, wow, look at these people. Like you saw in that New York Times article that I showed on the last slide before. It said, within 24 months, they were all dead. Like, this is shocking. This is so fast. And people were really, scientists were really perplexed that this illness would hit an otherwise completely healthy person, and then within a couple of years, they'd be dead. Well, come to find out that the doctors were not aware that the person was infected till they were way past this asymptomatic phase. They were coming in when they were on the absolute downhill slide. This asymptomatic phase can last for years. And, this is the thing that makes this illness really scary, is that, a person could be completely asymptomatic and yet contagious. Like, that's the scariest part. And so luckily we now have ways, we have tests that are easily available. And so you don't have to wonder if you or the person that you're with is positive or not. We can have tests taken and establish that they are or aren't. So let's talk a little bit about what is the likelihood that if you had a single exposure to a person who is in fact HIV positive, what is your risk of actually contracting HIV? So what I'm going to do is sort of list behaviors from higher risk behaviors to lower risk. In this field, we don't like to talk about, risk-free behaviors, unless we're talking about things like, not engaging in sexual behavior. Massage is fine. What we like to call dry kissing, which is where, you keep your lips together, stuff like that. Those are fine. Absolutely no risk. But I'm talking about like more sexual behaviors. So like, for example, the highest risk thing that a person could engage in is to be the receptive partner in anal sex. And even in that really risky behavior, if the person that is penetrating has HIV, there's a 1.4% chance that the person who is receiving anal sex would actually contract it. So it's not as communicable as they once told us. Receptive vaginal sex. So the woman in the coital situation has a 0.08% of contracting HIV if the man is positive. If you are the man, or you are the one who is inserting your penis into someone else's anus, and the person who is receiving anal sex is the one who's HIV positive, could the person who is inserting contract it? Well, about a 0.06% chance that the person who is inserting their penis could contract HIV from the person whose anus is actually HIV positive. I think that was a weirdly constructed sentence, but I'll just keep going. Now, if you are inserting your penis into the vagina of someone who is HIV positive, you have a 0.04% chance of contracting HIV. Performing fellatio, being the person who is performing fellatio, you have a 0.02% chance of contracting HIV. That's really low. I mean, it's I almost moved it a little farther down on the spectrum because it's low. But if the person ejaculates into the mouth and the mouth has any kind of cut, or let's say the case that I showed you earlier that has herpes simplex 1 on the roof of the mouth, that kind of open sore, that does give entry to the bloodstream. And so in those circumstances, but in a healthy mouth, there's very low risk. All of these are so close to zero that I'm just putting them down at the zero level. Receiving fellatio, receiving cunnilingus, there's no risk to the HIV is not carried in the saliva. So for the person who's receiving fellatio or receiving cunnilingus, they would have to have some kind of cut or herpes or something that gives entry to their bloodstream on their genitals. And then the person performing fellatio or performing cunnilingus would also have to have some actively bleeding thing going on in their mouth. You know what I'm saying? So it's effectively zero. Performing cunnilingus, there's not enough viral load in vaginal secretions. So again, it's effectively zero unless, everybody's bleeding, right? And it's, so if maybe you're performing cunnilingus on a menstruating woman and you have a cut in your mouth, then yeah. But I mean, it's effectively zero because that's pretty outlandish scenario I just gave, right? Pretty uncommon. Deep kissing, they used to think, oh yeah, you could catch it from each other's saliva. But again, you'd have to have two people with actively bleeding mouths for that to actually contract. So I put all those down as effectively zero. That doesn't mean that you should have unprotected, fellatio or cunnilingus. You can still use, dental dams or something to protect from all the other things that are very easily contracted from, semen or from vaginal secretions. So I would just like to remind you guys of that. So factors that can increase your risk of contracting HIV beyond what's listed here. So like that makes it more likely that you would contract HIV would be if this HIV positive person that you're having contact with has a higher viral load, right? Like they've had the disease longer, or, when they caught it, they contracted more of the virus at the time. Having a higher viral load means that there are going to be more viral molecules deposited in the semen or in the blood. Having STIs, I keep mentioning, having an active case of herpes really makes it more likely, but also, other bacterial ones or genital warts. These things can make it more likely that your immune system is going to allow penetration by HIV. Vaginal infections like bacterial vaginosis or yeast infections can cause irritation on the vaginal mucus layers. And so you can actually have little micro cuts that will allow for transmission of HIV directly into the bloodstream. Any kind of tearing and abrasion, so, rough sex or anal sex without any kind of lubricant or something like that can really make it more likely that you've got access to the bloodstream. Having sex during menstruation or some other kind of bleeding situation, those make it more likely that your risk will go up. Now, things that can decrease risk would be the person having a lower viral load, but also if the person who's having contact with an HIV positive person is taking PrEP, right? They haven't been exposed yet, but they know that their romantic partner has HIV. You can use PrEP to lower your own risk of contracting it. If, on the other hand, you have contact with somebody who turns out to be HIV positive, you can, after the fact, take PEP, and that'll help to prevent you from actually contracting it. It turns out that if you're male, having been circumcised makes it less likely that you will contract HIV. The data is a little mixed on whether you reduce your risk of giving it to a partner, particularly female partners, but it seems to be protective for the person themselves that they are circumcised. And then using lubrication so that you reduce the likelihood of tearing and abrasions and things like that. So there are things that we can do that are pretty simple, like using lubrication. I should buy stock in lubrication companies or something, because I advertise them all the time. So you could do little small things like lubrication, and then you could do bigger things like PEP or PrEP, depending on your exposure. So here I'm going to share with you some 2018 data from the Centers for Disease Control, who track all of the different infectious diseases of all sorts here in the U.S. So the most recent data is from 2018, and they said that we had 37,968 new HIV diagnoses in the United States and the dependent areas in 2018. And, a lot of people kind of think that HIV sort of gone away because we really don't hear much about it. But 37,968 infections is kind of a lot. New infections in that year. This isn't people living with it. We've got millions of people living with it because they accumulate over time, right? This is just in that 1 year, basically 38,000 new diagnoses. Of those new diagnoses, 69% were among gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. So we're going to talk about that as our number one risk factor. 24% of those new cases were among heterosexuals, and 7% were among people who inject drugs. So those are sort of our snapshot things I wanted to show you. Now, still talking about that same CDC data from 2018, and I kind of repeated some stuff on the bottom so you remember what the overall case count was and stuff like that. What we're seeing is them breaking it down by race, sex, and sexual behavior category. So we see that the men are in the red bars and the women are in the blue bars. And at the top are Black or African Americans who engage in male-to-male sexual contact. And we see that that's the largest group, followed by Hispanic or Latinos who engage in male-to-male sexual contact, and then white male-to-male sexual contact. So our biggest group is, males of any race who are engaging in sex with other males. Then we have Black or African American women who have only had heterosexual contact. And then we have the next smaller bar is Black African American men who have only had heterosexual contact. And then we have Hispanic women, Latinas, who have had heterosexual contact. And then at the very bottom, we have white women who have had only heterosexual contact. So what we can see is that there's, clearly male-to-male sexual contact is a much bigger risk factor for men than having heterosexual contact, regardless of the race of the person. And then women who are having heterosexual contact, with the exception of Black African American men, women who are having heterosexual contact are at higher risk than Hispanic Latinos, who aren't showing up even on our graph because their number is so small, or white who are having just heterosexual contact, white men. So there are different risk factors that have to do with who you're having sex with, and then whether you're male or female. Those things matter. I thought it'd be interesting to show you something that I think is kind of scary and horrifying, which is that the biggest proportion of cases is among the 25 to 34-year-olds. What we're experiencing right now is, a whole generation of young people who really don't have a lot of firsthand awareness of the dire straits that can be HIV. And they have actually seen a lot of people living with HIV. I mean, you look at Magic Johnson, who's been living with it for 30 years. And a lot of people have sort of looked at it like, well, it's treatable. It's not that big of a deal. And so they've been having unprotected, risky sex. and not really thinking that it's that big of a deal. And, so here we have 13,491 young people who, for the rest of their lives, are going to be, dealing with the repercussions of them not taking it very seriously. And it's expensive. That's a bad thing. It is harmful to your body over time, so probably going to end up in a shorter lifespan than the person would have had otherwise. I mean, there are just a lot of factors that I don't think that when we're 25 to 34, we're really thinking about too much, right? And probably they were infected more when they were like 20 to 29, right? They probably were even a little bit younger when they got infected. And what we're finding is, for example, the newest generation of young adult males who are going to have sex with men are really taking kind of a laissez-faire attitude about it. They think, well, I'll just take PrEP, or I'll take PEP afterward, or, things like that are making it really risky. And so hopefully I can, underscore to you guys, I don't want to be a 1980s fearmonger who tells you don't have sex. I want to be a 2020 rational person who says, limiting your sex partners, having, if you're a man who has sex with men, you might want to make sure that testing is just a regular part of your routine and something that you require of all sex partners, things like that, because you want to protect your future health. So that's my little soapbox thing. All right, so now this is looking at only men who have sex with men, and by racial category. The percentage of new infections in 2018 by racial category among men who have sex with men. So we have Blacks and African Americans being the largest proportion. And what I did was I put in those little greater than, less than symbols. I inserted the percentage of that racial group in the population. So in the American population, Blacks and African Americans make up 13.4% of the population. But among that's a rough estimate because it's including women, and it's including, in that 13.4%, and it's including men who have sex with women only. So it's not even the case that the Black African Americans who are men who have sex with men make up 13.4% of the American population. I'm just going to say they probably make up 13.4% of the men who have sex with men population, just to make it super clear that 37% of these infections being among Black African Americans, that really is 3 times higher than it should be, minimum. So they are what we call overrepresented. So something's going on that is leading to this overrepresentation. Whites are underrepresented. They account for 27% of the cases, but they are 60.1% of the larger population. So whites are underrepresented. Hispanics, Latinos are overrepresented. They make up about 18.5% of the population, but they are 30% of the infections that were reported in 2018. Multiple races, they're pretty much on target. Asians, they're a little underrepresented, about half of what you would expect based on their rate in the population. American Indians and Alaskan Natives, they're roughly right about where, proportionally you would expect them to be. And then among Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, the CDC just says that they account for less than 1% of the infections. And I know that they account for 0.2% of the population. So I'm not sure exactly how close they are, but it looks like pretty close. What we're seeing is certain groups being overrepresented among men who have sex with men and then ending up with HIV infections. I also want to point out to you that on this slide, I put N equals 26,198 because that's the number of cases out of the total that I had reported to you before that was 37,968, I think. 26,000 of them, 198, were among men who have sex with men. So that I wanted you to clearly see the N that we're working from, and then the proportion of that N that is accountable by different racial groups. We've been spending about 40 years trying to figure out why it is the case that we have these racial disparities. And we don't have a clear and simple answer. It's possible that we have sort of some racial differences in susceptibility to the infection, just biologically. Among whites, there's a subset that is particularly from Northern Europe that carries a variant of a gene that actually makes it less likely that they will contract HIV, that they actually can end up fighting it off. So it may be that whites are underrepresented because they actually happen to have this mutation that makes them less susceptible. So it's not super simple, and it's not super clear why we have these racial disparities. Now, I thought you guys might find one of our maps informative here. So the lightest blue is when you have fewer than 10 people per 100,000 of population who are infected. So you'll notice that Washington State is 6.7 per 100,000 people who are HIV positive. That who got diagnosed in 2018. So 6.7 per 100,000 got diagnosed within 2018. The average for the entire U.S., I put there at the top, the total rate is 11 per 100,000. So here in Washington State, we're below average. Some states are basically right at average, like California is at 11.9. So they're sort of right at average. I thought I'd attract your attention to Washington, D.C. If you look over there, you'll notice it's 39.1. That is not a typo. They are at 39.1 per 100,000. So they're well above average, right? They're almost 4 times the average. So these disparities, again, between regions and states are an interesting question. What the CDC clearly is very concerned about the fact that the South is overrepresented, right? We've got Georgia with 23.8 per 100,000 being diagnosed in 2018 with HIV. That's a pretty high rate. So the CDC is trying to figure out some of these, these kinds of data anomalies, and they're trying to drill down and go after it. Some areas it's very rare, and some areas it's unfortunately pretty common. So back to our stages of infection. Our last stage is called other HIV disease. They used to call it full-blown AIDS. So AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. It is characterized by opportunistic diseases like I was talking about before, Kaposi sarcoma, PCP, which is that shorthand for that special case of pneumonia. So typically, in the 80s, a person would come to the doctor, they were already in full-blown AIDS. Everybody had missed stages 1 and 2, and the person presented at the doctor with full-blown AIDS and had, a couple of years maybe left to live. And so they really had this mistaken belief that, wow, this just really moves fast. I mean, I just found out this person has this illness, and then 18 months later, they're dead. This thing must really move fast. What we now know is that our immune systems actually do a really good job of fighting off HIV for a really long time, for years. But ultimately, the viral load gets greater than our immune system's ability to fight it off anymore, because as the virus increases, it's killing off our immune system. So there's this inverse relationship. As the virus increases, of course, it's killing our immune system. And so ultimately, when the balance goes in favor of the virus, then we get full-blown AIDS. So how can we prevent? Well, hopefully I've kind of clarified, limiting partners, right? The fewer partners that a person has in their lifetime, the less likely they are to encounter HIV. Condoms, there were, again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse because I keep comparing this to the current COVID crisis, but back when HIV was new and kind of just, being understood that it was carried in semen, and they thought in vaginal secretions, but it's really not. But they thought it was. They're like, okay, it's sexually transmitted. Let's use condoms, right? We use it for other sexually transmitted infections, or as they called them back then, STDs. But people, armchair people who don't really know anything said something that might sound familiar to you. Well, the pores that are in condoms are larger than the diameter of HIV. So HIV would be able to migrate through those pores, and so condoms don't even really work. They can't really work. So hopefully that probably sounds familiar to things that have been said about masks, right? Oh, the openings in masks are too big, and the virus would be able to get through, and this is all pointless. One of the things I can tell you about condoms, I'm not going to say anything about masks. I'm just bringing up the comparison, but I will say this about condoms, which is, while it's true that the pores are larger than HIV, they are technically larger than sperm, believe it or not. We've already discussed how to correctly use condoms, right? You're supposed to withdraw after ejaculation, remove the condom while the penis is still semi-erect, discard it, and do not put that penis back in contact with whatever orifice it had been in before. You do not transfer the bodily fluids off the penis into any mucous membranes. That's just that's how you do it. If you follow those steps with a condom, there's no opportunity for anything to pass through the pores of a condom. It won't happen. And so using a condom every time, using it correctly. If you're not a sex worker and you're using condoms, like one in a day, one in every 3 days, typical people tend to use condoms. Using the kind that are impregnated with nonoxynil 9 will give you an added barrier of death for HIV. Nonoxynil 9 is known to kill HIV on contact. So, but you wouldn't want to do that if you have a lot of sex with a condom on. You actually can make the mucous membranes more susceptible to infection. So, I'm saying literally like a typical couple who has sex every couple of days, a condom with nonoxynil 9 is added security. I see I forgot to close my parentheses on my next line there. So PrEP is what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a medication that is prescribed. First, the person has to have a negative HIV test and then another negative HIV test to make sure that they really are negative. And then they are administered the medication, and they have to periodically have their blood tested again to make sure that they have not become HIV positive. But generally the way that pre-exposure prophylaxis does, and also PEP, by the way, so post-exposure prophylaxis. I misspelled prophylaxis. Wow, I'm the worst on this slide. The way that both of them work is that they prevent the virus from making its first entry into your cells. So it makes your cells inhospitable to those viral marauders who want to come in there and start reproducing themselves from inside of your cells. So you have to take them before you're positive. You have to, and with PEP, you have to do it after you've been exposed, and it's a little harsher on you, but it is your backup plan. But the best thing you can do is limit partners and use condoms. Now, diagnosis. Okay, so this all should sound very familiar too, because it's very similar to what we're all going through with COVID testing, right? The most common HIV tests actually test for antibodies in the blood. And so think about that. You make antibodies with your immune system in response to whatever pathogen, right? So if you've been exposed to HIV, you'll make antibodies to attempt to fight off HIV. So if you have a test that measures antibodies and you administer that test to somebody who has progressed far enough in their HIV infection that their immune system isn't working very well, they may not have any antibodies to HIV when you test their blood, even though they clearly have HIV and clearly are having the effects of it. They don't have any antibodies because their immune system has shut down. So that was another thing that was very confusing and led people down some wrong paths back in the 80s, is that they had, they developed this new antibody test. They were administering it to people, and some of them who they thought had full-blown AIDS were coming back HIV negative. And that was causing armchair people, not scientists, armchair people to say things like, oh, they don't even know what causes HIV or AIDS. They don't even know what causes it. That's a red herring. It's not really HIV that causes AIDS. It's something else. Well, then they developed another kind of test that actually looks for viral RNA in your blood. And so even if your immune system isn't working anymore and can't make antibodies, this viral RNA test can detect the presence of the actual HIV in the blood. And so it's really specific and very accurate. It turns out now, with the treatments that we have available that can actually take the viral load down really, really low, the viral RNA test may tell you that you're negative. When in fact, if you stop taking the medication, the virus will come back out into your blood and start its storm again. So you want to make sure that you're using the correct test. So a person who has a 0 viral load but is known to be HIV positive, they probably need to be tested with the antibody test, right? Because their body is making antibodies to it, and the medication is doing that. If a person is far enough along when they first get their first test, they might want the viral RNA test because they are no longer making antibodies. So it's, some of the false negatives and some of the false positives and those kinds of things have been corrected by the presence of more than one kind of test. A typical person who is going down to get tested will be administered the antibody test. It's the cheaper, it's the faster way to test for HIV. The problem with the antibody test, on the flip side, for a person who's, maybe newly infected, is they might get a false negative for up to 6 months after exposure. And so a person who believes they've been exposed should always follow up with a second test. It's, so stressful to have to go through something like that, to find out that maybe one of your previous sex partners has tested positive for HIV. And then you have to go get tested, and you want to make sure that you wait at least 3 weeks after exposure. And let's say you get the negative result and you're like, oh, thank goodness. You really need to wait and go back again in another 10 weeks and double check that you haven't started to make antibodies at that point. And that's the nightmare. I mean, you're living 3 months waiting to find out. Today with our COVID testing, we are unhappy that we have to wait 2, 3, 4 days to get our COVID tests back. At least it's, 2, 3, 4 days, as opposed to, and with COVID, you'll typically start displaying symptoms, if you're going to have them, within 2 weeks for sure. And, whereas with HIV, you might not start to show any symptoms, or may have interpreted your symptoms incorrectly. And so it's really, really hard on a person who's been exposed. And so if you've ever been in that case, I just really want to, lend some empathy, because that is a really stressful time. All right, do not write down any of this. I deliberately and actually this is probably not incomplete. They are perpetually inventing new treatments for HIV. They're really, within 10 years of identifying HIV, they had a cocktail that was working decently. Not perfect. Like I said, a lot of toxicity on the person. And so it wasn't great, but it was slowing down the effects of the virus. Today, they have a really just an array of options, and, depending on how far along in the infection the person is, what their viral load is, things like that. There are a lot of different medications and treatments that are available now that really are extending people's lives. So the problem is they are really, really expensive. That is a fact. It's an expensive treatment, but they really have a lot of things available now, so that you have people like Magic Johnson who have lived for 30 years with the illness. And he says that, periodically he thinks to himself, maybe I'm cured. I mean, I feel fine. My viral load is 0. Maybe I'm cured. And so he'll stop his medication and then, get tested, and there's the virus again. So he's feeling good. He needs to stop doing that though. But, we are perpetually adding new things to this list of treatments. And so I just wanted to impress you with just the length as it is of treatments. And like I said, there's probably even new things. I didn't look because I thought, you know what, it's getting long enough. That's a pretty good list. So just to, sort of support my claim that they're working on this. All right, well, that's enough on viral infections. Let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back and talk about bacterial infections in the next segment.